Hello everyone and welcome to a Bear Reviews Indie Sideshow as we take a look at War Mongrels. A review that almost never was. For as it turns out, War Mongrels is actually a name that breaks community guidelines over on Twitch. I don't really know why, but there you go. But before we start, I should just make a few notes. Loading up the game is definitely worth going into some of the options, in particular game and interface. Not only here will you have access to your difficulty settings, which you can change at any time. Interestingly, bringing in the idea of enemies being lazy and no friendly fire, hint hint for later, but you'll be able to change different settings including tutorialization and tooltips, as well as, for anyone who's wishing to actually do this as a speed run, an in-game timer to show off your speed for each chapter, and the one I'm most interested in and really should be noted, the save system. Currently I have autosaves on and have autosave slots to 3, meaning the game will allow up to 3 autosaves or quick saves before then overriding the old ones. Now you can bring this down to 1 or all the way up to 10, with 3 just being the default setting. It's worth having a look in there, particularly if you're starting to struggle with the game, just so you can increase the amount of autosaves available to you and give yourself a bit more breathing room. It's not going to make a massive difference, but if you're a little forgetful when it comes to making those proper saves, at least the autosaves and possibly quick saves will have you back. And as always, looking at our video, I'll just note that I'm playing pretty much everything on absolute max while using a GTX 1080. And although I've hit a few bugs here and there, we'll come to that again later, I haven't actually noticed that much in the way of performance issues. Now, initially you will not have access to too many of the extras, however, having played a little bit myself, we can go into our collectibles for checking out all the various collectibles that you will find throughout your campaign. Now, all of these are written in the original language, whatever that may be for the specific item, with, when hitting read, a full translation to whatever language you're playing on being available. It's a great way to show the actual historical evidence alongside explaining what the heck it means. But as you can tell, I'm not the best at getting these, so I don't have much to show off, sorry. But in switching over to the game, we can see that there are options for multiplayer on this, allowing you to team with your friends and engage in a little guerrilla warfare if you can get it to work. But coming back and loading up our campaign, we're greeted in Mission 3 by a selection of characters: Manfred, Evold, and Lucas. These are the characters given for Chapter 3, with different characters being present in each chapter, meaning you're going to have to get used to a bunch of different characters and all of their abilities, as well as looking towards combining their skills as you go in order to complete each mission, each coming with their own distinct abilities and characteristics, as well as the potential to learn a little bit more about them and their points of view should you leave them together and let them have a little chat. Now, much of your game is going to be spent moving your camera around, right-clicking all the enemies you can see, and thankfully there's no limit to line of sight in this. You can check the entire map without ever moving your characters in order to survey not just the land itself, nor the characters and their ability to see things, but also to find different hazards you may use to help thin the enemy's numbers a little, or some node points you can move through, make life a little bit easier for yourself, taking full advantage of the cover as you do, leaving your effectiveness to basically come down to how best you can coordinate all of these characters with all of these skills, environmental hazards, and ability to block the line of sight of enemy patrols while still making some kind of sense of what's going on. And thankfully the game has made it incredibly easy to tell just how this works. Right-clicking on our soldier here, we can see a solid view cone in front of them, meaning if any of your characters are in that area, you're going to be seen. Now, this will build up with a red line until it meets you, at which point they'll be fully alerted, giving you a little bit of a chance to bug out before any guns are drawn. However, I've found it does this at a surprisingly fast rate, so it actually can be extremely tricky to deal with them regardless, especially considering you can only see the sight cone of one guard at a time. But as well as that guaranteed visibility area, we also have a striped section, be this at the full extent of their visibility cone or because it's an obscured area from their view, and if you are crouched while moving through this, you actually won't alert them. Something to note though is that these sight cones are very much set in stone, meaning if you are directly next to the edge of a sight cone, walking past the enemy, they're not going to see you. It's very useful, granted, it actually lets you do quite a lot in the game, but you do kind of sit there thinking, how do these people not have peripheral vision? It kind of pulls you out a bit of the immersion and really does show you are playing a game and that's how the game works, but with it, as I said, being rather useful and actually at times kind of necessary. Take this one as you will. After all, there has to be a limit to how much the enemy can see, otherwise it would be impossible to actually get the drop on them. So if you fancy skirting the edges, it's definitely a valid tactic here. With each of your characters having their own special abilities, it's definitely worth taking the time to go through each and every one of them and seeing just how best you can effectively utilize them. Particularly as the characters you bring in will change from mission to mission, resulting in different parties being accessible for different missions, and different tactics need to be taken because of this. Taking for example in Chapter 3, Manfred's whistle ability allowing him to bring enemies closer without giving away his position, along with Lucas's foothold, will allow you to set up a pretty darn effective trap, bringing the enemy in and destroying them all in one go. However, since the foothold trap will leave them howling in pain, this of course will draw more enemies towards it, perhaps giving Emerald the chance to get in on his brawler skill and take out 2 opponents at once. Real way you'll be using these abilities though is in setting them up to work simultaneously. By pressing tab, you'll be able to bring up the ability to set up multiple characters with multiple abilities in sequence, then hit enter and have the whole thing play out nice and quick, allowing you to dispatch multiple guards simultaneously and clear some of the way forward. To aid in this, there is the option to use a minimap, though quite frankly, I have not found it all that useful. It just seems to be a little too small an area to really get a good idea of what's going on, and since it doesn't show their sight cones, you can tell where they're facing, but that's kind of it. Now where the game falls down is a lot of the time you're going to feel like using quick save and load is kind of the only way to complete it. A sheer dumb luck and stubbornness as you try anything you can think of to try and get past the guards in the hope that it'll work out in the end. Essentially meaning that a lot of the feeling of skill actually gives way to more of an acceptance that this is just trial and error, and through the constant retries, victory becoming an inevitability rather than a reflection of your ability. It's not the intended way to play, but there are times where it kind of feels like that's the only way to do it, particularly as due to the fact that there are occasional moments where you will actually need to fight the enemy. If you've messed up earlier and managed to leave yourself with next to no health, it can pretty much lead to you soft locking yourself out of completion. Though given how the audience for this sort of game is certainly going to be looking to do things stealthily, I can't really hold that against it too much, as I said, I feel like the whole point of this game was really going for that hardcore style. Me though, it just feels a little too hardcore, and I'm not convinced I didn't lose sometimes by my lack of skill, but simply because the devs decided you shall not do it this way, you must find the correct method, preventing me from actually engaging with the game and trying to discover my own ways to complete each mission and simply try and do it in the way that they designed, treating it less like a stealth RTS and more like a legitimate puzzle game in trying to find the specific way that the devs intended for it to be completed. Which really does draw into question why exactly we have Hunter mode. So if during a mission all hell breaks loose and you're literally forced to return fire upon the enemy, or if you're stealthing the stealthiest, you can hit C, draw out your weapon, hopefully something automatic, and actually engage the enemies in an isometric shooter. Unfortunately, this doesn't really help. Now it seems that this was put in as something of a last resort or to work for specific set pieces within the story. Unfortunately though, it doesn't really help that often in terms of having that final defense, that final chance to save a complete and utter mess up in the game. The reason for this is A, your characters are super weak and you're going to take like 5 hits and get knocked down, so it's not really going to give you much of a chance to recover, especially considering the enemies are going to be coming from all sides and just absolutely hammering the living heck out of you. Cover doesn't really work that well, particularly for isometric games. You're better off just running and gunning, but your squad AI seem to have some kind of love affair going on with lead. So even if you should somehow manage to clear the way and open the path for your freedom, the chances are one of them copped it, so it was absolutely for nothing. Though I should note, if you are willing to play the game in basically the cheapest way imaginable, you can actually play this as somewhat of a shooter. Unfortunately, it becomes more of a hide-and-seek match, as you aim to grab as fewer enemies as possible to try and lure them into position. It's a weird thing to consider, but I will admit I only actually managed to do this because I decided for the review I have to give it a try. Now, this took a significant amount of planning and a hell of a long time to actually pull off, to the point where I'm kind of depressed to say so. So don't go on thinking that you'll be able to do this sort of thing regularly, as it is definitely not the way the game is intended to be played. But do bear in mind that the enemy may well bring in reinforcements and completely scupper your plan, so it'll only work to a certain extent, and after that, well, good luck. And I have to admit that really, at the end of it all, it didn't really seem to be worth it, as I wasn't able to advance all that far, in fact only clearing out a section that I didn't even need to enter. And I'm being a little harsh on this, but the reason I do so is that the isometric stealth gameplay and the isometric shooting gameplay don't mash well together. If it is supposed to be a final last-ditch effort, then you need to have a feasible chance of actually recovering. Now, if there's only 1 or 2 opponents, sure, fair enough, you have a chance, but the weaponry is that loud that it's going to be drawing other enemies towards you, so you inevitably end up fighting half the army. With the alternative then being, well, if I'm supposed to use the guns, let's run forward. No, that doesn't work, because then you're definitely going to fight the entire army. And in honesty, it's left me thinking this is really just there for those set pieces within the campaign without really being intended to be brought into the gameplay at large. Especially considering that a stealth game isn't really going to be prompting you towards using outright conflict unless it's intending to be more of an action-based stealth game, in which case fair enough, Metal Gear Solid, go for it, but it doesn't really feel like that. Particularly with the way the map's set up and the way the guards are positioned and the fact that they will act together if they're in a group, the chance of actually taking people on in an action style is pretty slim. And so what I'm getting at in this awkwardly roundabout ramble is basically that it feels shoehorned in and not an organic part of gameplay. It works well when it's in a set piece, but that's about it. The rest of the time, honestly, I would leave it be and instead look more towards using your skills and picking opponents off piece by piece and using some more of those environmental hazards to lure enemies in, or some of the more explosive capabilities that come in later to deal with those larger groups. A genuinely fun last stand addition to the game, giving you a little bit of an opportunity to try and survive whatever hell you've gotten yourself into, but it acts so in counter to the rest of the game that I simply can't get into it. It really draws you out of what you've been doing and removes all the momentum that you've built up so far. For after all, if you have those unlimited retries, eventually you're gonna break through. And even though I comment on how this is a little difficult and a little cheap in that difficulty, no matter how hard each mission was, somehow I still managed to get past them all. All the tools were there, you just had to find the right way to use them. And what it will really come down to is, do you have the patience? I've got to say, dropping the difficulty actually did very little to change just how difficult the game is, as, in all honesty, the real difficulty comes in from the sheer quantity of guards moving around, the positions they're in, and the fact that it only takes alerting one for pretty much your entire run to just be absolutely scuppered. Yes, quick load and quick save were definitely the way to complete this. Without touching anything, the game actually went back to normal difficulty anyways, so if you die, do expect that to reset. And it's a real shame that this is the case, as having played such a fantastic game as Tenchu Z, its approach to difficulty was actually to change the amount of guards, change their routes, change their positions, change their armaments. It genuinely affected the difficulty of the game in regards to the stealth aspect. Sure, combat was still absolutely merciless, and if you went up against a boss, you got minced beyond compare, at least on higher difficulties, actually on lowers as well. Yeah, that's another one with a weird mechanic thrown in. Why would you have bosses in a stealth game? But it meant that in playing each level on different difficulties, you actually genuinely had a different experience. You were playing a mission where very few guards were there, so you had more ability to move around, explore the map, and actually engage in those stealthy, sneaky tactics and developing your skills before then upping the difficulty and having to really hone them into perfection to ensure that you could maintain that stealth. Now there were an increased number of guards, and since you've explored the environment, you'll be able to find new routes to take should you find your previous run is now untenable. But there is one thing that the game actually kind of excels on, and that's the environments. More importantly, the sheer oppressive nature of them. Although heightened, the game definitely has plenty of historical basis, and when in charge of your saboteurs, you'll have to confront quite a fair few of those horrors of war. And seeing as this is World War II, they really are horrors indeed. But the brutality doesn't end there. In fact, watching the war mongrels at work, you can definitely tell that these are saboteurs and not trained assassins, often dealing with their opponents in a rather brutal manner. But at the end of all that, I can honestly say the game just isn't really for me. I enjoy stealth, but this is pushing it too far. The difficulty is too demanding. The difficulty forces so much trial and error that, honestly, sure, eventually if I bang my head against this, I will complete it, but with 12 chapters to get through and the sheer amount of time required to get to chapter 3, for me, it's just not worth it. There are times where the game all comes together and things just work well. You can pull off some pretty advanced combos, multiple enemies dispatched simultaneously as you sneak your way towards your victory, but those moments are few and far between. 9 times out of 10, you're simply hitting quick save, do something, then quick load. And all of that assuming that the game doesn't just crash. Now, this wasn't a problem for me for a very long time, but recently, it's crashed more and more often. And with the updates deleting that progress, the mick has officially been taken. To any of you hardcore stealth players out there, I wish you good luck. This could indeed be fun for someone looking for a challenge, someone who enjoys isometric stealth. And the animations for the campaign were really well told and actually very well made. There are real times where the game shines and you can see exactly how things are coming together and shifting you towards a specific style of play. Unfortunately, at other times, it kind of feels like the game has lost its sense of stealth and is more about this almost rushed tactic of getting in there, ignoring the actual sight cones and just trying to deal with the guard before they can react. And it's weird that when you suddenly stop playing a stealth game, it actually rewards you. It's had me really question exactly what the genre of this game is, as I'm never quite sure if I should be working towards that stealthy outcome, sneaking around and trying to take out guards one by one without anyone else noticing, or just running head first up to them and taking a knife to the situation, which in itself is fine. That's a fun way to play a game. It's just when you're moving back and forth and you can't quite get into a rhythm of figuring out and playing the game the way it's intended, but instead shifting between two extremely different styles of play, it just draws you out, and it leads to that frustration I was mentioning before, where you're never quite sure if you're losing because of some random character off screen seeing you, or if you're supposed to simply rush it, or if this is now when you're supposed to be all skillful, sneaky stylings. In honesty, it's just an issue with consistency. And honestly, it does feel like that would really improve the game by applying more of a consistency to it. I understand that there are options in it for the hunter mode, a genuinely fun style of play and a good way to engage in those last-ditch efforts to remain in the level and somehow survive, but it adds so much in counter to the style of stealth gameplay that has been introduced and really reinforced with tutorializations. It's like the game just doesn't know what it wants to be. And that's why it's been so hard to review this when I'm looking at it not really knowing what I'm meant to take from it. It is a good game, it is fun, but it's also frustrating and at times downright confusing. Unless you really are into hardcore isometric stealth games, I can't actually recommend this. Taking a look over at their Steam page, you'll see that we currently have mixed reviews, with 63% of users actually reviewing it positively. And the reason, pretty consistently, is bugs. Now, the developer has made everyone aware that they are continuing to support this, providing plenty of updates to try and get rid of as many of these bugs as they possibly can. Unfortunately, many still exist, and one of the key reasons for many of these negative reviews is that whenever these updates come in, it would actually leave you unable to continue playing from your prior save. Meaning, yes, in these extremely long, extremely difficult campaign chapters, you may well lose all progress you have within them. Now, for a good player, this might not seem too bad, as you can simply go back and replay your way through, now with a better knowledge of the map and how the patrol routes will work. But if you're like me and not the best in the world at these, it's pretty demoralizing to lose potentially hours worth of gameplay, as genuinely some of these maps took me multiple hours to complete. But that's not entirely due to the difficulty. A lot of that is simply because they're actually pretty darn big and pretty darn long, with multiple cutscenes and different sections all brought together, in theory, with nice checkpoints within them, provide you plenty of opportunities to save up and rest and come back later, with the patches unfortunately removing that final aspect. Just unfortunate that any of these bugs arise typically in the form of the entire game shutting down, and you can clearly see where the developers were going when the game was being created. But at the end of all that, we'll simply have to wait to find out whether or not the kinks get smoothed out of the war mongrels. As should down the line these bugs start to be removed, this could indeed be fun for someone looking for a challenge, someone who enjoys isometric stealth. But for me, it just didn't click. But either way, I hope this was helpful in deciding if War Mongrels was for you. So until next time, peace out.